There's a very specific, almost heavy feeling you get when you sign a lease.
Mm.
You're sitting there, maybe in some sterile leasing office with really bad coffee, or maybe just at your own kitchen table.
Right.
And you're just staring at page after page of this dense legal jargon. And as you sign your initials over and over again, bottom right, the back of your mind, this document, it basically rules your life for the next 12 months.
It is a binding contract. It feels absolute, almost like the law of gravity.
Exactly. It's like physics.
Yeah.
And because it feels so absolute, we tend to think of the relationship between a landlord and a tenant as this unshakable thing.
It's just a given.
Yeah, it's a simple equation. You pay, you stay. You don't pay, you leave.
Mm-hmm.
But then you hear a term like rent strike, and it just sort of glitches that logic. It breaks the physics of it.
It sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? I mean, in our culture, we associate strikes with labor.
Right.
We think of factories, picket lines outside a coal mine, maybe teachers walking out.
A worker stops working to get better wages. They're withholding their labor. But a tenant,
Yeah.
the tenant isn't, producing anything for the landlord.
They're just existing. They're living.
Right. So when I see headlines about rent strikes, my first thought is usually, okay, that sounds chaotic. That just sounds like a bunch of people ran out of money and are trying to rebrand it.
And that is such a common misconception. If you look at it from a distance, without the context, it does look like a financial dispute, a transaction gone wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But if you dig into the research we've pulled for today, and we have a massive stack here, truly, you realize that a rent strike is rarely just about the check. It's a high-stakes, high-risk leverage tactic where the home itself, it becomes the battlefield.
And that is exactly what we're doing today. We're doing a deep dive into the hidden history of the rent strike, not just as a flash-in-the-pan news story, but as this historical phenomenon.
A recurring one.
We're going to look at the mechanics of how you actually fight a landlord who, frankly, holds all the legal cards.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to look at the history, which is wilder than I expected. I mean, we're talking medieval peasants, 20th century shipbuilders, even modern university students.
We have sources covering arrears lists from the 15th century all the way to the tin houses of California farm workers. It's a huge sweep of history that really highlights how people fight for their own space.
So if you're listening to this and you rent your home or, even if you own property, this is the history of the power struggle that defines where we all sleep at night. But before we get to the medieval peasants, we need to lay down some ground rules.
Some definitions.
Exactly. We need to define what we're talking about because the words really matter here.
They certainly do.
So what is the actual difference between a strike and, say, me just being broke and missing a payment? Because to the landlord, the bank account looks the same. It's empty.
The result might look the same on a balance sheet, sure, but the intent and the mechanism are completely different. If you, as an individual, can't pay your rent because of hardship, you lost your job, you had a medical emergency, that's a tragedy. It's a personal crisis.
But it's not a strike.
It is not a strike. A rent strike is a collective direct action. It's political.
So it has to be a group. It can't be a solo act.
It has to be a group. The power lies entirely in the collective. I mean, think about it. If one person withholds rent, they're just a non-paying tenant.
Right. You get an eviction notice?
You get an eviction notice, you get a sheriff at the door, and you're out. But if an entire building or a whole neighborhood or a city withholds rent, well, you can't evict everyone. You break the enforcement mechanism.
That's that nuclear option phrase I saw in the notes.
It is absolutely the nuclear option for a tenant. And we have to be really clear about the stakes right at the top here. This is not a game. For the landlord, obviously, a strike is a loss of revenue and a loss of leverage. But for the tenant, if you do this wrong, you aren't just making a point. You're facing eviction.
Okay, that's huge.
You're looking at a destroyed credit score, a blacklist that might prevent you from renting elsewhere, potential legal consequences, and, literally being put out on the street.
It's not something people do for fun. It's definitely not a hobby.
Never. It's an act of desperation, but also strategy. It happens when the status quo just becomes unbearable.
So let's get into that strategy, the how. Because I think most people assume a rent strike is just everyone shouting, stop payment, and, hoping for the best.
Right.
But looking at the breakdown here, there are serious mechanics to resistance. It's almost like a military operation.
There is, and it all revolves around that one concept. Leverage of bargaining power.
Which, usually, the tenant has zero of. The lease is written by the landlord for the landlord.
Individually, yes. Zero. A standard lease is designed to give the property owner all the power. But the landlord has a vulnerability.
Which is?
They have bills, too. They have mortgages, property taxes, insurance, maintenance costs. They rely on cash flow. Their
Right.
entire business model assumes a steady, predictable stream of income.
So the strike attacks the cash flow.
Right.
It chokes the engine.
Exactly. But you can't just stop paying and go buy a new TV with the money. That's a very quick way to lose public support and lose in court.
Of course.
The sources all emphasize that successful strikes almost always involve organized groups, typically tenants' unions, and one of the first things they do is create a war chest.
A strike fund.
A strike fund, yeah. Or crowdfunding in the modern era, because if the landlord drags you into court, and they will, you need legal representation. You can't fight a legal battle on an empty stomach or with empty pockets.
You need to show that you have the money. You're just choosing not to give it to the landlord for a specific reason.
Precisely. It's a strategic withholding, not an inability to pay.
Now, I want to double-click on this one specific tactic mentioned in the notes because it sounded incredibly devious. The rolling rent strike. This sounds like something out of a spy novel.
It's a fascinating piece of legal maneuvering. It really shows how sophisticated these movements can get.
So who came up with this?
This was devised by two lawyers, Lester Evans and Richard Levinson. They were affiliated with the Met Council on Housing in New York, and they were looking at the traditional way of striking, which was putting rent into an escrow account.
Okay, pause. Escrow.
Oh.
For the non-lawyers listening, that basically means giving the money to a neutral third party, right?
Correct. You say to the court, Your Honor, I have the money, I'm willing to pay, but I'm holding it here in this safe account until the landlord finally fixes the boiler.
It shows good faith.
Exactly. It shows you aren't just trying to steal the service. You're a responsible party in a dispute.
Okay, so escrow is the polite way to fight. What is the rolling strike?
Evans and Levinson realized that escrow was safe, but it was predictable. The landlord knew where the money was. They knew eventually they might get it. So they came up with the rolling rent strike. In this scenario, the tenants pay rent 1 month and then withhold it the next. Then pay again. Then withhold.
They toggle it. They're turning it on and off.
They toggle it month by month. Or sometimes they rotate which tenants are paying and which aren't.
Why? I mean, that sounds like a headache for everyone involved.
It's a massive headache, and that is precisely the point. The goal is to confuse the legal process.
It's like you're gaslighting the accounting department.
Essentially, yes. Think about it from the landlord's perspective. You prepare eviction papers for non-payment for, say, month A.
Right.
By the time you get a court date, the tenant has paid for month A, but now they haven't paid for month B. So your whole case for month A is moot. You have to start the paperwork all over again.
Oh, that is wicked. You're always one step behind.
It keeps the landlord in a state of absolute uncertainty regarding their cash flow. They can't predict their revenue from 1 month to the next, and the courts get clogged with all these confusing, half-resolved cases.
So you weaponize bureaucracy against the person who usually uses bureaucracy against you.
Precisely. It turns the predictability of rent, which is the only thing banks and landlords really care about, into a variable. And frankly, it protects the tenant a little bit more than a total refusal, because they can always argue in court that they have been paying just inconsistently.
That is next level strategy.
Right.
But let's back up to the why. We know how they do it. But what pushes people to this point, I assume the rent is too damn high, is, reason number one.
High or rising rent is definitely the most common trigger, certainly. We see that again and again throughout history. But looking at the record, poor maintenance is a massive, massive driver. We're talking about unsafe, unhygienic conditions.
The classic slumlord scenario.
Right. Rats, mold, no heat in the winter, holes in the floor, sewage backups, things that make a home unlivable. But also just general housing insecurity, the fear that you could be kicked out at any moment for no reason.
But the notes also mention that sometimes it goes beyond the building itself.
Absolutely. And this is where the rent strike connects the micro to the macro. Sometimes the strike isn't just about the boiler being broken. It's about civil rights. It's about social housing policy. It's about challenging the entire political status quo.
Which we're going to see later on when we get to places like South Africa. But let's go way back to the beginning. The sources have this section called Roots of Rebellion. And I was shocked to see a date that starts with 14.
Yes. The 15th century.
Are you telling me that medieval peasants were doing rent strikes?
In a sense, yes. We have evidence from the 15th century in these things called arrears lists, which are basically the accounting books of the feudal lords.
Okay.
And there's a specific Latin phrase that the scribes would note down. Quia tenentes negant solvere.
Quia tenentes negant solvere. My high school Latin is non-existent. What's that mean?
It translates literally to because the tenants refused to pay.
As simple as that.
Simple as that. It wasn't that they couldn't pay, they refused to pay. And the really important part is that it's written in the plural tenentes. Exactly. It implies a group, a collective refusal, right there, recorded in the Lord's own ledger. So this act of withholding payment as a group is centuries old. It seems that as long as there have been landlords, there have been tenants figuring out how to say no.
That's wild. But the modern rent strike, the kind where you have picket lines and banners and that sort of thing, that comes later.
That really accelerates with industrialization and urbanization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Because suddenly you have masses of people cramming into cities, living in buildings owned by strangers, rather than, working a plot of land for a local lord.
The relationship changes. It becomes anonymous, it's transactional.
It becomes transactional and much more concentrated. But there's this fascinating American example that kind of bridges that gap between the feudal style and the modern urban style, the anti-rent war in New York State.
The anti-rent war, that sounds like a movie I definitely missed. This was 1839.
1839 to 1845, upstate New York, in the Helderberg Mountains area.
Okay, set the scene for us. Why was there a war in upstate New York?
So, even though this is America in the 19th century, the land of the free upstate New York was essentially operating under a feudal system. It was called the manor system, and it was run by these figures called patroons.
Patroons? That sounds very Dutch.
It was a holdover from the Dutch colonial days. These huge tracts of land were owned by a single family, the patroon. And the people living there, the farmers, they didn't own their farms. They owed labor, crops, and rent to the manor lord. It was basically medieval Europe.
In 1840s America. That's incredible.
Yes. And eventually, the tenants just said, this is un-American. We fought a whole revolution to get away from kings and lords. So they declared independence from the manor system.
And how did that go over? Did they just stop paying?
It got violent. They formed armed bands. They actually disguised themselves as calico Indians wearing masks and these calico dresses to hide their identities.
Wow.
They used tin horns to signal each other across the valleys, and they would resist tax collectors and sheriffs, often physically preventing them from selling off farms for unpaid rent.
So it wasn't just we're not paying, it was we are physically blocking you from enforcing the debt.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is, they won.
They won. Against a system that had been in place for centuries.
They successfully demanded land reform. The state constitution was eventually amended to abolish this kind of feudal tenure. It was a massive victory against a semi-feudal aristocracy right here in New York.
That's incredible.
It really shows that even these deeply ingrained systems of property can be overturned if the resistance is fierce enough.
So it starts in the fields, but then it moves into the city. Let's talk about New York City in the early 1900s. The sources mention a couple of really big strikes, 1904 and 1907.
The 1904 strike was the first mass rent strike in New York City. You had about 2,000 families striking over rising rents, and they actually won some rent reductions. It proved the concept could work in the dense urban tenements.
But then 1907 happens, and the scale just jumps.
1907 was a massive, massive escalation. We're talking 10,000 families in Lower Manhattan. That's not a protest, that's a small army.
And speaking of armies, the general of this army is someone I had never heard of. But now I'm completely fascinated by her. Pauline Newman.
Pauline Newman, yes. You have to picture this. She was 20 years old.
20. At 20, I was barely managing my own laundry.
She was a Jewish immigrant, a teenager really, working in the garment industry. And she organized these 10,000 families. The newspapers called her the new Joan of Arc.
I love that image. A 20-year-old leading 10,000 families against the powerful landlords of New York. And this wasn't just men, right? The sources make a big point about the role of women.
Oh, that's a crucial theme that runs through almost all of these stories. Housing has historically been the domain of women, especially in this era.
How so?
Well, the men were at work in the factories. The women were the ones at home dealing with the rent collector, the broken stove, the leaking roof, the sick kids. They were on the front lines of the housing crisis.
So it makes sense they'd be on the front lines of the resistance.
Exactly. So when the resistance started, it was often led by housewives and women working in the garment industry, like Pauline Newman.
And what was the result in 1907? Did they win?
It was mixed but significant. About 2,000 of those 10,000 families won rent reductions. It showed that even the poorest, most marginalized populations, immigrant women, garment workers, could force concessions from property owners if they banded together. It really put the landlords on notice.
And this wasn't just a New York thing. The sources say that around the exact same time, 1907, we see something similar happening down in Argentina.
Yes, down in Buenos Aires, it's almost simultaneous, which is fascinating. They had these tenement houses called conventillos.
Conventillos.
And the strike there was massive. 32,000 workers were involved. And the sources note a heavy presence of anarchists and socialists.
So it's very political from the start.
Very. This goes back to what we said about the macro issues. This wasn't just about rent. For them, it was about class struggle. They saw the landlord as the ultimate symbol of capitalism, exploiting the worker at their most vulnerable point, their home.
So the early 20th century is really heating up. You have New York, you have Argentina, but then we hit World War I. And this, to me, is one of the most cinematic stories in our entire stack of research.
Yeah.
Glasgow, 1915, Mrs. Barbour's army.
This is arguably one of the most famous and most successful rent strikes in history.
Right.
To understand it, you have to understand the context of Glasgow in 1915.
The war is raging.
The war is raging. It's the height of WWI. And thousands upon thousands of workers are flooding into Glasgow because the city's shipyards are building the dreadnoughts and cruisers for the Royal Navy.
So it's the engine room of the war effort.
Absolutely. So housing is incredibly scarce because everyone is moving there for these vital jobs.
And at the same time, most of the local men, the husbands, the fathers, the sons, are away fighting in the trenches in France.
Exactly. So you have a severe housing shortage, and the households that are left are mostly run by women.
And the landlords saw an opportunity.
A huge one. It's cynical, but they viewed these women as easy targets. They started raising rents, sometimes by up to 25%. They just figured the men are gone, these women will just pay up or get out. They have no protection.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake. They completely underestimated the women of Govan and Partick, specifically women like Mary Barbour, Mary Burns-Laird, Helen Crawford, and Agnes Dollin.
This is Barbour's army.
They organized a resistance that was incredibly physical. This wasn't about writing letters to the editor or filing complaints. This was direct action.
The details here are hilarious and also awesome. It says they used visceral physical resistance.
They did. They had a system. The women in the tenements would sit in their windows with bells. And if they saw a bailiff, that's the officer sent to evict someone approaching the street, they'd start ringing the bells.
It's an alarm system.
It's an alarm system. And suddenly, hundreds of women would pour out into the street. And they were armed.
Armed with what, not guns, I assume?
No. Armed with flower bombs, wet clothes, and general refuse. So imagine being a bailiff. You're just trying to serve a notice, and you get pelted with a sack of flour and last night's dinner scraps.
And it gets even more humiliating for them. The sources mention a very specific tactic. They would pull down the bailiff's trousers.
Stop. They pantsed the officers of the court.
They pants them in the middle of the street, in front of the whole neighborhood. In some cases, they would physically pick them up and throw them into the midden, which is the communal trash heap in the back court of the tenement.
I mean, the psychological impact of that, it's not just resistance, it's total humiliation. It's saying, your authority means nothing here. You're a joke.
It sends a very, very clear message. You cannot enforce an eviction if you are being laughed at and covered in garbage. But the real genius of Mrs. Barbour and the other organizers was that they knew this physical resistance wouldn't be enough on its own.
They needed more leverage.
Exactly. The strike had to spread beyond the tenements.
And it did. It went to the shipyards. That is the ultimate nuclear leverage we talked about earlier. The women went to the shipyards where their sons and brothers and neighbors were working on these vital warships, and the shipbuilders, in solidarity, threatened to go on strike. They said, if you evict our families from their homes, we stop building ships for the war.
And there's a war on. They are building the very ships that are fighting the Germans.
Precisely. The government in London panicked. They absolutely could not afford a labor strike in the munitions sector. It was a direct threat to national security. Lloyd George, who was the Minister of Munitions at the time, basically got on the phone and said, fix this now.
So the landlords weren't just fighting a bunch of angry tenants anymore. They were suddenly fighting the entire British Empire's war effort.
They were. The balance of power shifted completely. So on November 27, 1915, the government rushed through legislation specifically to restrict rents to pre-war levels.
The 1915 Rent Restrictions Act.
It was a total victory for the tenants. And it happened because of that incredible solidarity. There was even a famous protest where thousands of workers marched to the court to support 5 women who'd been summoned for non-payment. The crowd was so huge and angry, the sheriff had to dismiss the case just to prevent a riot.
That is such a powerful example of how housing issues can ripple out into the wider economy and even national security. If you push tenants too hard, you might accidentally shut down a shipyard.
Exactly. It proves that housing is infrastructure. If the housing isn't stable, the workforce isn't stable.
Okay, so let's move forward a bit. The war ends, but the strikes don't. We enter the interwar years, and things get cold.
Very, very cold. We're back in New York City, 1918 to 1920.
What's the context here? The war is over.
The war is over, but you have a housing shortage caused by it, and on top of that, you have a severe coal shortage. It was a brutal winter, and landlords were either running out of coal or in some cases refusing to buy it because the price had spiked so high.
So they just stopped heating the buildings in a New York winter.
Yes, but they kept raising the rents.
You're literally freezing to death, and you're paying more for the privilege. That sounds like a recipe for a riot.
It sparked what were called the freezing flat strikes. It actually began as a safety issue. People were getting sick, literally dying of pneumonia in their own apartments. So the strike morphed from give us heat to we will not pay you rent until we get heat.
And the scale here seems massive as well.
We're talking tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of tenants involved across the city. It forced the state to act. And this led directly to the passage of emergency rent laws in New York.
Why is that historically significant?
Because these were essentially the nation's first comprehensive rent control measures. They stayed in place all the way until 1929. So if you live in a rent-stabilized apartment in New York City today, the DNA of those laws comes directly from these freezing tenants in 1918.
It's amazing how these acute moments of crisis write the laws that we live by a century later.
And it happens again in Chicago just a year later, 1920, 1921. Another series of strikes there led to the Kessinger tenant laws. But there's a really specific detail in the Chicago victory that I love.
The heat ordinance.
Yes. They passed a city ordinance requiring landlords to keep flats above 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the winter.
68 degrees, so that's where that number comes from.
If you rent an apartment in Chicago today, or really in many U.S. cities, there is a legal requirement for a minimum temperature. That rate exists because people went on strike for it in 1921. It defines the baseline standard of living. It says you cannot legally charge rent for an icebox.
And these weren't just happening in the U.S. The sources mentioned Barcelona in 1931.
A massive strike. The numbers are hard to pin down, but estimates range from 5,000 to 100,000 people on strike.
Wow.
But it wasn't always a win, though. We have to be honest about the risks. The source mentions Sweden in the 1930s.
Right, the Olskroken conflict in Gothenburg, 1936-37. Sweden seems like a place that would have strong tenant protections.
It does now, but back then it was a huge battle. The tenants went on strike, but the landlords were very organized and they retaliated heavily.
What happened? What did they do?
They just started evicting people en masse. Hundreds of tenants were put out of their homes. The landlords had the resources to wait them out and the full backing of the legal system to remove them.
Ouch. So the tenants lost.
The tenants ultimately lost that conflict.
Yeah.
And it signaled the end of tenant militancy in that region for quite a long time. It's a really sobering reminder that collective action doesn't guarantee a win. The opposition has leverage, too.
Right. It's not a magic wand. And sometimes the win isn't even about the red check at all. As we move into the 1960s and the civil rights era in the U.S., the rent strike starts to look different. It's not just, I can't pay. It's, I won't pay because you are stripping me of my basic human dignity.
The shift in the 1960s is profound. You look at Harlem in 1963 and 64. This strike was led by an organizer named Jesse Gray.
Jesse Gray.
He was a brilliant organizer, and he realized that for the tenants in Harlem, the issue wasn't just the dollar amount on the lease. It was the rats. It was the falling plaster. It was the unlivable, dangerous conditions. He famously brought a cage full of rats to a court hearing to show the judge what his tenants were living with every day.
That's effective.
Yeah.
It's a very visceral way of asserting that a lease is a two-way street. You pay money, you get a habitable home. If the home isn't habitable, the money stops.
Exactly. And this philosophy, this tactic, was picked up by the biggest name in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr.
You know, I think a lot of people know MLK for the marches and the speeches, I have a dream, voting rights. But I had no idea he was so deeply involved in housing specifically. This was the Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966.
Yes, Dr. King knew that civil rights meant very little if you were forced to live in squalor. Economic justice was central to his vision. So he and Coretta Scott King did something remarkable. They actually moved into a slum apartment on the west side of Chicago, 1312 South Homan Avenue.
They moved in themselves.
They moved in. They wanted to experience the conditions firsthand and, just as importantly, expose them to the national media. It was sweltering in the summer, freezing in the winter, and the conditions were shocking even to them.
Talk about walking the walk.
And they tried a very innovative tactic called trusteeship. The idea was that the tenants would clean up the building themselves, they would claim trusteeship over the property,
Okay.
and then they would pay their rent to their own organization, the Freedom Movement,
Yeah.
to use for repairs rather than paying the landlord who was neglecting the building.
That sounds incredibly logical. You won't fix it, so we'll fix it with your money.
Logical, yes,
Hey.
but legally, very, very difficult.
Did it work?
The landlord actually sued them and won in court. It really highlights how the law is so often written to protect property rights over tenant rights, even when the conditions are horrific. The judge basically said, I don't care how bad the landlord is, you can't just take over the building.
So it was a legal loss, but was it a moral victory?
It was a massive moral victory. It brought national attention to the issue of urban slums. It forced the city of Chicago to confront its housing problems, and it paved the way for later housing reforms and the Fair Housing Act.
But around the exact same time, we have a much clearer victory out in California.
Yeah.
And this wasn't city apartments. This was farm workers.
Yes, the Tulare labor camps from 1965 to 1968.
The story's intense. We're talking about the National Farm Workers Association, which would become the UFW.
Exactly. And these workers were living in what were just called tin houses.
Literally tin huts.
Metal shacks. In the blazing California heat. No insulation, terrible sanitation. They had actually been deemed uninhabitable by the county, but the rent just kept going up.
So the growers who owned the land were just treating the housing as another tool to extract money from the workers.
It was part of the system of control, so they struck.
For how long?
They struck for 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
How do you sustain a rent strike for 3 years?
It takes an incredible amount of community cohesion and just pure grit. But they won. They stopped the rent increases, and eventually those tin huts were torn down and replaced with actual new houses. It's such a stark example of how even the most vulnerable workers, migrant farm laborers, could stand up to powerful agricultural interests if they held the line.
We also see rent strikes being used in these really intense political conflicts, like the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
Yes, it was used as a direct protest against internment, which was imprisonment without trial. People would withhold their rent and council rates from the local councils to deny the government revenue.
So it was a way of defunding the state that was oppressing them.
Exactly. It turns a household bill into a weapon of political protest.
And South Africa in the 1980s. This is maybe the ultimate example of the political rent strike.
In South Africa, the rent strike was an explicit weapon against apartheid. The goal wasn't just better housing. The goal was to end the entire regime. They wanted to gain ownership of their housing and cripple the state's control over the townships.
And the state responded with force, I assume?
Oh, yes. They sent troops into Soweto in 1987. It was treated as an insurrection. It was a war zone. But here is the incredible thing. By the 1990s, the state officials effectively stopped trying to collect.
They just gave up.
They gave up. The system simply could not process that level of mass noncompliance. Thousands of housing units were effectively turned over to the tenants because there was no way to force them to pay.
It goes right back to that nuclear option idea we started with. You can evict one person. You can maybe evict 10. Can you evict an entire township?
No. When the noncompliance is total, the enforcement mechanism breaks down. It proves that the entire system relies on our cooperation, and when we withdraw that cooperation, the gears just grind to a halt.
So we've covered a lot of history, but I want to bring this into the present day, because people might be listening and thinking, oh, rent strikes are a black and white photo thing. They happen in history books.
Right.
But they're happening right now. And interestingly, one of the hotbeds for them is at universities.
This is a newer trend, and it's really interesting to look at. Take UCL University College London. Between 2015 and 2018, you saw a huge movement called Cut the Rent.
Why were students striking? I mean, student housing is notoriously bad, but usually you just suffer through it for a year and then you leave.
That's the usual pattern. But the rents at UCL and other London universities were becoming astronomical, and the conditions were still terrible. Mice, flooding, the usual nightmares, but you're paying premium London prices for it.
So the students argued that the university was acting like a corporate landlord, not an educational institution.
Exactly, exploiting them for profit rather than providing a service. So they organized.
And how big did it get?
It started small, just 60 students in one hall. But it grew to over 1,000 students across the university. And yes, they won hundreds of thousands of pounds in concessions and rent freezes. Eventually, the total figure cited is over £1.5 million.
That is real money. That is a significant victory.
And the campaign spread to other UK universities, too. It shows that the student demographic, which is often seen as transient and hard to organize, can actually wield significant power. Yeah. They realize they're not just students, they're also tenants, and they're customers, and they have collective bargaining power.
There's also a very recent example here in North America, in Toronto Thorncliffe Park, from 2023 into 2024.
This one is a classic case. The landlords wanted an above-guideline rent increase, about 5.5%, and they were citing renovations they'd done in the common areas.
The lobby looks great, but my sink is still broken. Profit.
That's exactly it. Meanwhile, the tenants were claiming that their actual apartment issues, the real maintenance problems, were being completely ignored.
So what tactic did they use?
They used a tactic where they paid their rent into a trust held by the landlord and tenant board. It's a sort of formal, legal way of saying, we have the money, we are willing to pay, but not until you justify this increase and address our concerns. It's a more modern, bureaucratically savvy version of the old escrow account.
I just want to mention one more from the UK Kirkby in 1972, because it brings us right back to that powerful theme of women leading the charge.
The Tower Hill estate. A 14-month strike by 3,000 tenants.
14 months. The sheer endurance of these groups is just mind-blowing to me.
It really is, and this was led by the Unfair Rents Action Group, which was comprised mostly of women. The context was a factory closure crisis that hit the town hard, and it coincided with a big national rent hike.
So a perfect storm of economic hardship.
A perfect storm. It was a fight for survival. They picketed, they marched, they physically blocked evictions for over a year. It wasn't just about the rent increase. It was about protecting their entire community from dissolving.
So we've looked at all these examples, from medieval England to modern Toronto, but there's a section in our notes called the silence in history. And this really struck me. Why don't we learn about this in school? We learn about labor strikes. We learn about coal miners and factory workers. Why is the rent strike so often treated differently or just ignored?
It's a great question. And I think part of it is just the nature of the record keeping. Rent strikes often rely heavily on word of mouth and community organizing. Unlike big labor unions that have archives and newsletters and professional historians, tenant groups are often ad hoc.
They form to fix a specific problem, and then they might dissolve.
Exactly. They form, they fight, they win or lose, and they dissolve. And historically, who writes the history? It's not the tenants. The records we do have are often from the police or the courts. So they focus on the disturbance, the riot, not the underlying conditions that caused it.
Right. You see the arrest record, but you don't see the freezing apartment that led to the protest. You see the action, not the reason.
That's a perfect way to put it. Also, traditionally, historians analyze this only as a subset of the labor movement. It was seen as workers' issues, but secondary to what happened on the factory floor. But since the Great Recession of 2008, there's been a real shift. Academics are starting to look at housing movements as a standalone field of study in its own right.
That makes a lot of sense. As the gig economy grows and the nature of traditional labor changes, not everyone works in a factory anymore, the one thing that connects almost everyone is the need for a roof over their head.
Precisely. For many people, the home is the new factory floor in terms of economic struggle. Rent is the biggest bill most people pay every month, so the conflict naturally moves there.
So when we step back and look at this entire history, what's the big picture? What does this all mean?
I think if we connect all these dots, it reveals a fundamental tension in our society. The tension between property rights and human needs.
The right to make a profit from your property versus the right to not freeze to death in your apartment.
Bluntly put, yes. A rent strike forces that question out into the open. It challenges the assumption that the ownership of property is an absolute, unquestionable right. It asserts that the tenant, the person actually living in this space, has a stake and a voice in the conditions of their own existence.
It's really about dignity.
It is about leverage and dignity. It reminds us that laws and contracts are not forces of nature like gravity. They are agreements made by people. And when the terms of those agreements become unlivable, history shows again and again that people will find ways to break them.
And that leads me to a final thought I've been mulling over, listening to all this. We talked about the hidden history, the strikes that didn't get recorded, the ones that didn't make the newspapers.
Quiet rebellions.
Yeah, exactly. If so many of these massive history-changing strikes went unrecorded simply because tenants didn't keep meticulous records, how many are happening right now? How many small buildings or duplexes or neighborhoods are in some quiet state of rebellion that we won't know about for decades?
It's a very provocative thought. The history of this kind of resistance is likely so much larger than the history we have written down. We only see the ones that exploded into the public view. We don't see the thousands of small ones that were settled in a quiet, tense conversation after a check didn't arrive on the first of the month.
Something to think about the next time you sign that lease. You might be stepping into a history you didn't even know existed.
Indeed.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and keep looking closely at the world around you. You never know what you'll find in the fine print.